Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
It Held in the Night, Volume 3, Story 1. My grandfather was a full-blood Choctaw and was raised by his grandfather, who came to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears as a young man. My grandfather still held on to the old beliefs and ways of our ancestors, and always told me owls were messengers from the other side. He stressed they were bad news, and never should we talk back to one because they were looking for souls. He always made it a point to shoot them, or at least shoot into the tree where they were, in order to scare them off. One night, when I was around 10, a big owl started making a ruckus in the pecan tree in the front yard, and Grandpa picked up his gun and I followed with a flashlight. We found the owl sitting on a limb and staring straight at us, while making the most god-awful screeching noise I've ever heard. When my grandpa shot it, the owl half fell and half flew towards us and hit the ground about 6 feet in front of us. It took off, flopping through the field and screeching the whole way, with its left wing all mangled up. Fast forward to the next Sunday service, and we walked down the dirt road to the Pentecostal church they went to, and we noticed a new face in a seat. Grandpa walked up to introduce himself, and an elderly lady stood up with her left arm all wrapped up and in a sling. She said she knew us, and leant down to look at me and says, "Oh, I know you, and you're all kinds of trouble." This alone creeped me out, and after service, when she was walking away, she said she would have to come by and see us, so don't pull a gun on her. I know it bothered my grandpa, but as a young boy growing up in a different culture, it really gave me the weirdest feeling I've ever had to this day. Grandpa swore she was a witch, and him and my grandmother spoke about it that night, but it was never mentioned again. Story number 2. When we first bought this place, there were some creepy people who lived on the other side of the woods that backed up to our property, which were and are owned by a local sheriff. If one were to walk directly through the woods, it would be about 1.5 mile walk to these people's house. Their name was Cooley. The oldest and youngest were like a cross between the hillbillies in the movie Deliverance and the Klopeks in the movie The Burbs. Dirty, drug-addled, mean, evil, tortured animals, housebreakers, car thieves. Once concealed a murder in their home, you name it, and they more than likely did it. One day, I was out back building the first chicken pen I'd ever built. It was near the back of our property, maybe 40 feet from the back fence line. The woods behind the fence were thick, dark, towering old growths, oaks, pines, magnolia, gum, tupelo, and ash, and the yaupon, holly, beautyberry, and smilax, or greenbrier vines, undergrowing the trees, were so thick that walking around back there was almost impossible. You couldn't have walked more than 5 or 10 feet without having to go through or crawl under or over something. No exaggeration. In fact, it's still like that today. As I said, I was working on building my chicken pen when suddenly I smelled menthol cigarette smoke. There were no neighbors on either side at the time, and I knew no one lived in the woods behind our property. And as the smell was clearly coming from the woods, I knew someone was in there. I debated calling out, but didn't. I hadn't heard any unusual noises such as someone walking or thrashing around, just the usual noises of birds and squirrels. I wasn't armed and my husband wasn't home, and I was a long way from the house. I kept working for a while, kept listening for any noise, and kept smelling the cigarette smoke. I figured there was a barbed wire fence that whoever would have to climb over, and if I saw someone coming, I would have time to run. Too young and naive to even think they might have been armed. After a while I heard some snapping and crunching sounds, like someone stepping on small dry twigs and crunchy leaves. I stood there with my heart thumping, armed just with a shovel and a machete I had been chopping greenbrier vines with, too brave and stupid to run. I heard a couple more crunching sounds that receded, and I assumed whoever it was had left. A month or so later, I was at the feed store, and the lady working there told me that one of these coolies had broken into someone's house down at the end of the county road I lived on and injured the husband pretty bad. They found out who it was, by the description and by a couple of Marlboro menthol cigarette butts they found at the corner of their house. Neither the wife or husband smoked. So I figured I was being watched by the menthol cigarette smoking coolie who broke in down the road. To this day, people still know who the coolies were and are, as they have bred another generation of their progeny since then. Next story. Not too long ago, I went backpacking with my brother, his fiancée, and my best friend up in the high Uintas. We drove up to one of the most beautiful areas I've been to and started the 7-mile journey to our first night's destination around 11 a.m. The trail was beautiful, with tall firs and aspen trees along the trail and a creek flowing down from the alpine lakes 2,000 feet above the trailhead. The trail was muddy and beat up by the horses that the forest rangers used to maintain and patrol the area. We hiked fast and covered the first 3 miles in an hour before hitting the steep uphill section full of loose rocks and granite slabs. As we climbed, we passed numerous groups of people leaving the trail for home. During the weekends, the trails are quite busy, but during the week you'll rarely come across someone in the backcountry. As the trail leveled out, we came to a large open field of wildflowers with a quick flowing stream full of trout that meandered through the middle. We took pictures and all remarked at how stunning the sight was and debated on setting up camp in the field or pushing forward to our lake destination. We all decided to push forward since the trout in the stream were smaller than we wanted, and we were hopeful that we would catch a few monster fish for dinner that night. As we hiked through the field, we noticed a lone tent pinched in an area that present great views of the surrounding terrain, but was out of your direct field of vision if focused on the trail. We continued to climb elevation and made our way up the canyon for another mile before taking a short break. At this time, my brother decided to retie his boots and take his backpack off for a few minutes to rest. He was carrying over 50 pounds since his fiancée was new to backpacking and taking it easy with a 20-pound pack. My brother was a little worn out since we were clipping along at a good pace, and coming from living at sea level, he wasn't used to physical exertion above 10,000 feet. His fiancée and my friend decided to hike ahead while we rested up for a few minutes and chatted. After we felt rested, we hit the trail again and almost immediately came across a man in his late 20s or early 30s walking down the trail with a near-empty Nalgene bottle in his hand. The very second I saw the man, I had a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. The hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood up, and I instantly felt the desire to put distance between myself and this man that sent my spidey senses into overdrive. My adrenaline pumped, my heart raced, and I ran through scenario after scenario in a split second and had to neutralize the threat before me. As we walked closer, I forced a smile onto my face and asked him how he was doing, and he responded with, "Great, just getting some water from the lake." And then I forced out a, "Enjoy the view. We're jealous of your campsite," as we passed him. He seemed surprised that I knew where his site was and said, "I thought I'd be the only one up here," but in a way that didn't sound disappointed at all, and quite frankly creeped me out. My brother and I kept walking without saying a word for another minute and looked back in the man's direction several times until he was out of sight. I turned to my brother and said, "Did anything seem weird about that guy?" To which he responded, "Yeah." I was majorly creeped out, and for the life of me, I don't know why. What's going on? We continued chatting about it for the next half mile until we met up with my friend and my brother's fiancée. The first thing out of their mouths were, "Did you see that creepy guy?" It turns out that my buddy had climbed up a hill off the trail to see if he could see an off-trail lake we were going to hit up the next day. My brother's fiancée had kept hiking since she was a little slower than he was and had passed the man on the trail while my friend was on the hill. My brother's fiancée had the same experience as we had and was instantly creeped out and alarmed by the man passing her on the trail. The man hadn't seen my friend since he was a good ways off the trail and passed her without saying a word, but turned and stared at her as she walked away for a good 20 seconds. My friend said the look on his face sent chills down his spine, and he made his way down the hill quickly to my brother's fiancée without the man seeing him. After chatting about it for a solid hour, we hiked towards the upper lake until we came to the following conclusions. 1. Nothing about the man's body language, other than turning around to watch the girl, which was only observed by my friend, pointed to him being a threat. He smiled, walked, talked, and carried himself normally. 2. He was dressed like a normal middle-class white guy in the outdoors, with no threatening characteristics whatsoever. Clean-cut hair, no facial hair, no threatening distinctive marks, average height and slender build. The guy shouldn't have been intimidating or scary in the least. 3. Something about him having a near-empty Nalgene and telling us he went for water didn't seem right to my brother and I. This man wasn't carrying a backpack or filter that I could see, and it made no sense to hike to the lake that was over 1.5 miles away and up a steep hill for water when he was camped not 100 yards from a stream that the lake was feeding with crystal clear water. 4. Not only did this put this man, each one of us, on guard and creep us out, but the experience put all 3 men into a mental state where upon seeing him we wanted to beat him lifeless. I have only one strong feeling like that in my life, and each time I made sure I listened to that feeling that shot adrenaline through my veins and set blood pumping so quickly I could hear and feel my heartbeat like a drum in my head. It took over an hour for the feeling that I wanted to kill him to leave my system. For the record, I'm an extremely mellow and non-violent guy, and so are both my brother and my friend, but we each felt an extremely violent urge upon seeing the man. 5. We all agreed that the man was a danger and decided to make camp in an area that is well off the trail and fairly defensible. We also made sure that we were ready to meet a threat as a group and didn't leave each other's side that night. That night was still peaceful and enjoyable, but the creep show, as we came to call him, really put a damper on what should have been an extremely relaxing evening. In the morning we decided to hike to another lake off trail and to make our way through a boulder field instead of the grassy area to cover any tracks we would leave. We spent the rest of the day catching huge fish and delighting in the taste of fresh backcountry meals. The weather took a turn for the worse and started dumping on us, so we retreated to our tents for the night. We never did see Creepshow again, and on our way down out of the area, we spent as much time off trail as possible to avoid running into him. This experience, and a handful of others, I can't explain or understand. Both bad and good are experiences I'd love answers to, but we'll have to wait for the next life to receive. Was this guy a murderer, a rapist, a pedophile? What evil inside him caused 4 people to all have the same exact feeling when coming across him on the trail? Was it all in our heads? Next story. Speaking of meeting creepy people, I was camping at Big Sur with family and friends. We met some guys camping nearby and hung out with them for about a week. Nice boys from San Francisco. They were joined by an older guy, also very nice. The boys from San Francisco were leaving and wanted us to meet the mother of one who was picking them up. They were upstream across a small bridge and would meet my brother and I in a field. I decided to go along the stream with a small raft, and my brother decided to walk through the woods. I went past the hotel and stopped to talk to some people, then continued on, looking for the bridge. I thought at this point my brother was ahead of me. The stream got shallow and I was walking carrying the small raft. There was a guy sitting beside the stream. We said hello, and he came across the stream to where I was. He gave me instant red flags. He asked if I was afraid of being alone in the woods. I said there were other people around, that I just passed a group of people. He said there's no one there now. I glanced back, and the people I had just talked to were gone. When I turned back, he was standing closer. I looked down and saw his reflection in the water. He reached towards me, and I shifted the raft between us. He asked where I was going, and I said I was meeting some friends. He offered to drive me there, and I declined. He seemed to want me to be afraid. There was nowhere to go. I went into blonde airhead mode and acted like I didn't get what he was saying. I felt that as long as he thought I was moving away from where people were, that he wouldn't make another move yet. All I could do was try to lull him into thinking that I was going to make it easier for him, hoping that my brother was nearby or that I would reach my friends. I kept walking and he stayed with me. I babbled about plants and birds, trying to make him think that I wasn't picking up on what he was saying. We got to the bridge, and by this time the ravine was less steep, and we were nearly on the road. I hesitated for a moment, weighing my chances running down the road versus heading back into the woods. My brother was nowhere in sight, nor my friends. This was enough time for him to pick up a chunk of tree branch. I swung the raft between us just as my brother and our friends appeared. The older guy and another man grabbed the creep and dragged him off into the woods. The boys got picked up, and my brother and I walked back to our camp. My brother had been paralleling us the entire time, waiting to move when needed. Next story. In my early 20s, we had a group of us that hung out together. Most of us were old college buddies and knew each other very well. Well, one weekend, I was having a bonfire at my place. One of my best friends asked if he could bring a buddy over, so I said sure. I figured he's a great guy. I know that he won't bring anybody bad over. Once him and his friend arrived, we were introduced, and he seemed like a really decent dude. He was well dressed, clean cut, charming, polite, and very sociable. We had a great time that night. Everybody seemed to like the new guy, and I was starting to think, hey, we've got a new addition to the group. Started coming around more often with my friend, but things started to get weird. Every single one of us, except for my friend who was bringing him around, noticed there was something off about this kid. He really loved to talk a lot, and that's fine, but he really started giving us all the willies for some reason. So I started paying very close attention to things. The big thing I noticed is that most of his conversations were him asking questions, a lot of questions. I had 2 German shepherds that weren't the most friendly dogs, especially towards people. They were fiercely protective of the family, so I used to put them in my finished basement when I had company over. Well, that night, I opened the basement door to get a case of beer to throw in the fridge when one of my dogs slipped by me. I immediately grabbed him securely by his harness. He went into full attack mode like he was rabid, and it was all directed at guess who? I'm a pretty strong guy at 6'4", 230 pounds, but I was struggling to hold my dog back, who was 118 pounds. It was all directed at him. An alarm went off in my head because I noticed that the kid didn't even flinch. My dog was no more than 6 feet away from him, and he didn't even step back. Do you know anyone that would have zero fear of a German Shepherd in kill mode? Both of my dogs were professionally trained. I was astonished that they would not respond to anything. It was like they didn't even hear my commands. After I got my dog away and apologized, he just gave me a pat on the shoulder and with a sick grin said, "It's all right, buddy. Dogs usually don't like me." So the night pressed on and returned to normal. I got up to grab a beer out of the fridge for myself so I could get away from all the noise and laughing. Then finally, the last straw broke the camel's back. As I was walking back into the living room, everybody was laughing hysterically except for guess who? The second I turned the corner, we locked eyes, like he was waiting for me to turn the corner. That's when I realized it. This SOB had dead eyes. It chilled me to the bone. There was absolutely nothing behind those eyes. No love, empathy, remorse, caring, joy, or any other positive emotion. I'm no psychiatrist, but this kid was some type of sociopath or psychopath. It all made sense now. To end things on a non-confrontational note, I told everybody at the end of the night that there wasn't going to be much getting together at my place anymore for various reasons. I later called every one of my friends and told them why I said that. I met up with my friend who was bringing him by and explained what was going on. He wholeheartedly agreed and respected my wishes. Shortly after he stopped talking to him, he said that he started acting kind of weird. Always, always, always trust your gut. Our instincts are there for a reason. Next story. One time, me and my sister, we had this weird experience when we were kids. We would hike miles on the Mojave Desert, sometimes alone, sometimes together. She was hiking a mile or so from our place and some distance from a paved road that ran through the area. As she was walking, a car on the road stopped, and a guy got out. He was far enough away that she couldn't make out any details, but he started right for her. Sometime earlier, while sitting around talking, we had been discussing what I guess would be referred to as evasion tactics. Where she was at was a creosote flat, with the average creosote being about 4 or 5 feet high on average. Creosote bushes aren't dense at all. They're skeletal usually, but we figured out from watching animals we had over the years that if a cat or dog we were trying to catch got a little way off into the creosotes, you might as well give up. As skeletal and as far apart as they are, that cat or dog or jackrabbit would just disappear into them, and that was it. Based on this, we had played around with the idea of evading someone far enough by simply sitting down in the creosotes and crawling away on the desert sand. That's what my sister did. She sat down and just disappeared. The guy was still standing up, and she said she could peek up a little and see him, out there, a ways from the road, with his hand shading his eyes, scanning the desert trying to find her. We never knew what he was up to, but he walked back to his car and drove away. Next story. So this happened one time on a 2-day camping trip with my friends, Justin, Misty, Tessa, and Tyler. It's summer and we're out of school, so we decided to go camping at a nearby creek. This creek is an offshoot of a larger creek that is usually packed with weekend campers, and we didn't want to deal with the friendly neighbors and their hot dogs and coolers, so we went to a secluded spot I found last year. Anyway, we drove up there and hiked to the spot with our gear. Except Tessa, who was a first-time camper. I hiked up her gear and set up. I should also note that I had my dad's 870 and Justin had another rifle. So the day goes on and it was great. Justin and Misty hit it off and shared a tent. Tyler brought his own, and Tess and I decided to see if the NEO double nest is really a 2-person hammock. It's not. Fast forward to the end of the day and we're all drowsy. Tessa is out like a light. Tyler and I are talking, hanging out of our respective sleeping apparatus, and Justin and Misty have zipped up and there's a sock on the tent post, so I'll count them as sleep. At about 11 p.m., Tyler piles on the wood for the fire and we both doze off. Fast forward again to about 2 a.m. I don't know why, but I was just bolted awake. I got that gut feeling and my adrenaline pumped, but I didn't know why, so I checked the fire, which was out, and I figured that that was the reason that I was feeling that way and started to calm down. Then Tyler poked his head out and shot me a look. The feelings started back up, so I put on my boots and grabbed the gun and got out of the hammock quietly so I didn't wake Tessa. Tyler did the same. We then crept over to Justin's tent to find that he was also up, but thought he was just being paranoid. He was still half asleep. At that moment, all hell broke loose. Down by the creek, something started splashing. Not normal splashing, but something closer to hands hitting the water very hard. And then it started screeching, humanoid, but not quite, like a large man screaming high-pitched while also gargling. I can't even begin to describe what it was like, but it resonated. It was high-pitched, but we could feel it in our chest, blood-curdling and human, but familiar. Anyway, Tyler and I both aimed down there and saw a figure, not distinct due to the darkness, but it was certainly human, but with very long legs, and it was thin. We didn't see the legs at first because it was low in the water. This continued nonstop as Justin jumped out of the tent with his knife, and the girls woke up. Tessa just sort of blanked out and put her back to a tree while Misty took off down the trail. Then Tyler and I noticed its legs because it moved quickly out of the waist-deep water toward Misty's direction. We both saw this and sprinted up the trail after handing Justin the rifle. As we were running around a little bend, we heard Misty scream again closer, and then see her running around the corner still screaming. She didn't even stop. She ran right past us back to camp as we followed her. Back at camp, we started up the fire and decided not to hike back 2 miles to the car. Instead, we hunkered down and waited until morning, which was not too far away. We planned on staying up in shifts, but we couldn't sleep, so we all just stayed up. As soon as day broke, we left. Tyler and I talked about it, and we know what we saw. Misty will talk about it when she was at the camp, but won't go back into detail about where she ran and what she saw. She gets mad when I ask her to draw it. Between the two of us, we figured it was about 7 feet tall when it ran. Its legs were about 3/4 of its body. Ty says it had broad shoulders, but it was very thin. It had a normal-sized head for a 6-foot man, and it had long hands, but normal-sized arms. It was not a squatch or a mountain lion, that's for sure. And we were all sober. I don't get shaken up by stuff like this. Neither does Ty or Justin. Tess is a tough girl, so I don't think it bothered her too much. Misty, though, she's a poodle. Next story. This was a conversation that I had with Sergeant First Class at Guard Drill on a weekend not too long ago. My unit was over in East Tennessee, and the NCO, when he was younger, was out driving around with some buddies in Meigs County, which is pretty rural. As they were driving along, one of his friends said, "Hey, turn around, I just saw something." So they turned around and headed back. In a field, they see a dead cow and something crouched over it. They stood there and stared at it, and then it stood up on 2 legs and began walking away. It looked to be 8 feet tall per his description, and hairy. He swore up and down it was a Sasquatch. He said it scared the heck out of all of them, so they took off again. Eventually, they got their courage back and drove back to the site. The dead cow was still there, but the creature had departed. I've known this guy for 9 years, and he has never struck me as a liar, and doesn't really talk about ghosts or UFOs or anything like that, but he was certain he had seen something. There are actually a couple of other guys in my unit I've known for equally as long that have also claimed to have seen one. One story is from one of my maintenance NCOs. He was out hunting, sitting in his tree stand, when he looked out across a field and saw something brown walking. He looked through his scope, and he said it was something brown, covered in hair, walking on 2 legs, and looked massive. He said he didn't want to shoot it because he didn't know what the heck it was, and didn't want to accidentally turn out to be a guy that he shot. But just the same, he's pretty sure that it wasn't a regular person. Next story. My grandfather and a friend of his told us the story of when they were young men in the early 1920s. They were fishing and canoeing the back country of Upper Michigan, about 50 miles from the Minnesota border. On their 4th day of canoeing, they came across what appeared to be an abandoned campsite. There was a dirty, partially erected tent fallen down, some camping equipment, a couple of sleeping bags, and a rusted shotgun. The campfire pit had charcoal in it, but it looked like it hadn't been used for a long time, and there was a small pile of firewood along with a rusted saw and axe. The food cache looked like a bear or some other scavenger had been through it, and all that was left were a few rusty cans. My grandpa said they saw an open tackle box by the tent, but they didn't see any fishing poles or canoe. He said for where the camp was located, the person or persons would only have traveled by canoe. He said both he and his buddy had goosebumps the whole time they were looking over the campsite. They reported to the game warden. Best guess is that some fisherman met their demise or drowned on the river, and no one knew where their stuff was camped out at. He never did hear if the game warden went back for the items or not. My grandpa said that brief stop on the river bugged him for a long time after that. Next story. It was the weekend before my son's birthday, which is August 9th, and we decided to take him and my other son camping since he would be with his dad the next weekend. On Friday evening, I loaded up our van with all of our camping equipment so we could head out early Saturday morning. The plan was to drive to the Linville Gorge area in North Carolina, hike to Linville Falls, and then hike to Table Rock. Afterwards, we planned to camp in one of the Forest Service campsites along the Forest Service Road that takes you to the Rock Table Trailhead. Anyone familiar with this area knows that the camping along the gravel dirt forest road is primitive and dispersed, not like your typical campground. Few sites are within view of each other. They are spacious and beautiful, but are really more like pull-off areas right along the road. It was a gorgeous day, and we spent the day hiking and having a great time. By the time we returned to our van after hiking to Table Rock, we were all hungry, tired, and ready to find a place to camp. As we started back down the road, we saw a lot of beautiful campsites, only a few of them occupied. We stopped to look at a few, but something just didn't feel right. After talking about it a few minutes, my husband and I both kind of looked at each other and said, "Let's go home." I actually couldn't believe I just said that, since we had about a 3-hour drive back home. I had gone to the trouble to pack up all our gear. It was almost dusk, and we were so tired and hungry. Still, we drove home and fixed dinner about 10 that night. The next evening, I turned on the news and was horrified to find that a couple camping in one of the spots along the forest road had been murdered, shot, and slashed the night before. I can't help now but to think that something inside both of us was telling us we did not need to be there that night. So I am now a firm believer in paying attention when something doesn't feel right. Next story. One of my customers told me this story. I will tell it from his perspective. My father, uncle, and I loved to go duck turkey hunting, so we were always going out in the woods and swapping with our shotgun. I can't remember where this was located, around the Appalachian Mountains maybe. We were taking our boats across the swamp water to go to a secluded area to try out a secret honey hole for turkey that my uncle had heard about. We pulled the boat up to the bank and headed off into the woods. We had been walking for about 30 minutes when we came into the knoll, and all I can remember is I saw a bunch of metal, and the next thing I knew was that I heard this loud bang and I'm burning on the inside. My uncle was laying on the ground bleeding and my dad was dumping his shotgun into the general area of the steel. My dad told me to run to the boat and he was grabbing my uncle. We made it back to the boat and made it to the hospital. I had been shot by 12-gauge buck and my uncle had taken most of the blast. We were both going to be okay after several days in the hospital. The police told us that we should just forget about it and they wrote it down as a hunting accident. We had come up on some really serious moonshiners and found their still. End of story. He looks back on it now and laughs, but he says it was the scariest thing he'd been through. Next story. When I was in high school, probably around 17 years old, me and my sister was about 15 at the time, were home alone one weekend while our mom was out of town. We lived in the middle of nowhere in farm country, and there were only 5 or 6 other homes within a few miles of us, which all belonged to families who we had known our entire lives. This particular night, I was watching TV in the living room when my sister ran in all upset and told me she heard something tapping on her bedroom window. I chalked it up to her being an overactive, imaginative teenage girl and told her it was probably bugs flying into the window attracted to the light or something. She went back to her room and went to bed. Eventually, I fell asleep on the couch watching TV. Around 3 a.m., I suddenly snapped awake and sat straight up on the couch with a very uneasy feeling. My hair was standing up. I felt like I was being watched, the whole 9 yards. I looked around the room and saw nothing out of the ordinary. But a few seconds later, I heard a loud pop coming from the dining room, which had a set of bay windows in it. We had a little Yorkie inside who was actually a really good watchdog, and she instantly went nuts barking. That's when I realized the pop I heard was the screen being pried off the dining room window. Now keep in mind, you can easily see the living room from those windows, so if someone was looking in, they could definitely see me sleeping on the couch. As soon as I realized what was happening, I jumped up and ran across the living room to the gun cabinet and grabbed a 20-gauge pump, which was already loaded with buckshot. I got in the corner and kept the gun pointed right at the windows. Being that we lived so far out of town, the police usually took 12 to 15 minutes to respond to calls out there, so I didn't even waste time picking up the phone. A few minutes went by and I hadn't heard anything, so I decided to investigate. I slipped out the back door and crept along the side of the house, then peeked around and saw nothing on the front porch. At that point, I got on the porch and leaned up against one of the support columns and just sat there listening for any movement in the darkness. That's when I heard a distinct sound of someone running through the leaves about 50 yards away from the house. It was pitch black outside, and I couldn't see anything, but I could tell they were running along the edge of our fence line. Not wanting to fire at something I couldn't see, I aimed a shotgun at the ground about 10 feet in front of me and fired a round, followed by a string of profanities that would make a sailor proud. After all the commotion ended, I could no longer hear the footsteps. I had no idea where they ran to or if they were still on the property. That question was answered shortly when I heard a loud slam off in the distance. Our house sat on top of a hill, and our backyard was basically a steep 300-yard slope that leveled off where it met the woods. At the bottom of the hill, we had a large iron gate that you had to open to get into the woods. It was heavy enough that we never tied it shut because the horses couldn't push it open. You'd swing it open, walk through, and it would slam shut behind you. This was the loud noise I heard. Looking back, what I did next was probably a dumb idea, but I was 17 and felt 10 feet tall and bulletproof. I grabbed a 3 million candle power spotlight, jumped on my four-wheeler with a shotgun, and hit the woods full speed. I rode every trail, stopping periodically to shine my light while constantly yelling threats to whoever or whatever was out there. I never did find anything, but I like to think I scared the living hell out of whoever was prowling around. Like they say, the only thing a maniac is afraid of is another maniac. They probably thought I'd gone mad. A few things still bother me about it to this day. First of all is the fact that whoever this was could see me laying on the couch and obviously didn't care. They had also apparently been watching my sister through her window. What really gets me is that the iron gate was not visible from the road, and very few people knew it was there. How they managed to run straight into it in the dark is beyond me. I also have no idea where they could have come from or where they ran to once they made it to the woods. That patch of hardwood goes on for miles, and there are no houses or roads for a long way, just a maze of rough four-wheeler trails. Best I can figure, they probably saw me grab the shotgun and ran from the porch at that point. To this day, I keep blinds on all of my windows and close them at night. It's a very eerie feeling to know someone was out there watching us from the darkness and not being able to see them from inside.